The wind carved through the canyon with a mournful cry, sharp and endless, as though the land itself wanted to speak of loss. High above, the sky stretched wide and pale, the kind of Colorado morning where winter still lingered despite the promise of spring. At the very lip of a cliff, where rock dropped into nothingness, something stirred, a faint human sound, strange and out of place in such a vast and merciless wilderness. Wrapped in a frayed quilt, hardly more than a bundle against the stone, lay a baby. Her cries rose thin but urgent, fragile against the gusts, yet powerful enough to echo through the gulch below. No settlement was near, no wagon train visible, no campfire smoke rising in the distance. Whoever had placed her there had vanished, leaving her to the will of wind and vultures. It was fortune or fate that another soul passed within earshot. Jedediah Cole guided his mule along a narrow ridge, eyes scanning the horizon with the habit of a man who trusted no land to be friendly. He was nearly 50, with shoulders bowed by years beneath heavy packs, his coat patched with buckskin, his beard streaked white from snow and age alike. Men in town whispered he had once been a guide for settlers heading west, but those days had slipped into silence. For years now, Jedediah lived alone, trading pelts in Gunnison when winter loosened its grip, then disappearing again into the high country. That morning, his ear caught the sound. It was not the call of hawks, nor the yip of coyotes, nor the whistle of wind through pine. It was higher, thinner, desperate. He reined in the mule, heart tightening against his ribs. "Now what in thunder?" he muttered, sliding from the saddle. Boots scraped gravel as he stepped toward the edge. The cry grew clearer, a small wail swallowed by the canyon's echo. When his eyes found the bundle, his stomach dropped. "Lord above," he whispered. A child. She lay on a narrow shelf of stone, no bigger than his saddlebag, fists trembling as though defying the cold air itself. Jedediah froze, mind racing. In all his years he had seen cruelty, men shot in disputes, livestock stolen, families broken by hunger, but never had he seen something as unthinkable as this. To leave a baby here, perched on death's edge, was a cruelty the wilderness itself could hardly rival. Gripping a root jutting from the rock, Jedediah lowered himself with slow, practiced caution. His boots searched for holds, fingers scraping stone as the wind tugged at his coat. He descended like he had done 100 times after strayed mules or fallen traps, but this was different. If he lost balance now, both he and the child would vanish into the abyss. The cries sharpened as he reached the ledge. The baby's face was red from cold, her eyes startlingly blue, round with fear. For the first time in years, Jedediah felt a pang strike deep, something raw that he thought long buried. "Easy, little one," he murmured, scooping her up against his chest. The coarse wool of his coat enveloped her as he pressed her close. Miraculously, her wails softened, settling into the faint whimper of exhaustion. But as he steadied his grip and prepared to climb back, a whisper cut through the air. "Don't go!" Jedediah froze. His head snapped upward, eyes searching the rim. Empty rocks stared back at him, wind whistling through cracks, but nothing more. "Don't go." The voice came again, faint yet near, as though carried by breath, not wind. His heart pounded. Was someone above? A woman? The mother? Or had his solitude twisted his senses at last? No figure appeared. The canyon gave no answer. Silence, save for the steady beat of the infant's heart against his chest. Clutching her tighter, Jedediah climbed back to the trail. The mule snorted at the sight of his burden. He stared out at the endless ridges, the forests, the distant snow-capped peaks. He had not chosen this moment, but it had chosen him. And to those who find themselves drawn to stories like this, where survival, morality, and fate collide on the wild frontier, don't forget to subscribe now, so you won't miss what comes next. For this cry at the cliff was only the beginning, and the fight ahead would test more than one man's strength. Jedediah Cole, long a ghost among the mountains, was about to step into a struggle far greater than his solitude had ever prepared him for. Jedediah Cole sat by a small fire that night, the baby nestled in the crook of his arm, wrapped tightly in his old buffalo coat. The flames crackled, sending sparks upward into the black sky. The stars above spread endless and sharp, the kind of stars that only men who lived far from towns ever learned to count on. Beside him, his mule shifted restlessly, ears twitching with every distant howl of wolves. For years, Jedediah had lived this way, alone, moving from ridge to ridge, never calling any place home. Once, long ago, he had known the laughter of companions, the voices of families traveling west with dreams of new beginnings. He had guided wagons across rivers, shown men where to find water, helped women choose the safest passes through the Rockies. Back then, his name had meant something, but the world changed. Railroads carved new paths, towns rose where once only buffalo roamed, and mountain men like him faded into the backdrop. Now he was just another relic of the wilderness, scarred and silent. And truth be told, he preferred it that way. Human voices had brought him little but disappointment. The mountains asked no questions, they only demanded respect. Still, tonight was different. Tonight another heartbeat rested against his chest. He looked down at the child. Her tiny mouth had gone slack in sleep, her breath warm against the coarse wool of his coat. Jedediah felt a knot in his stomach. He had no idea what to do with a baby. He had no milk, no proper cradle, no gentle hands trained for this sort of care. His world was one of axes, rifles, and snares, not lullabies. "Reckon you picked the wrong fool to stumble on," he muttered under his breath. Yet even as he said it, he adjusted the coat to keep her warmer, tucking the edges more securely around her. Memories came unbidden, memories he had buried deep. A wife once, years ago, taken by fever before they'd ever made a home. An unborn child she never lived to bring into the world. That loss had carved a hollow in him, a hollow he had filled with solitude and stone. Now, staring at the infant in his arms, he felt that hollow stir. The fire popped. He reached for a strip of dried venison, chewing slowly, while his eyes never left the child. Morning came cold, the sky streaked pink and gold. Jedediah rose stiffly, joints aching, and slung his gear onto the mule. The baby whimpered, hungry perhaps, though he had little to give. He tried dipping a rag in water and letting her suckle, but it quieted her only for moments. Her cries pierced the air, unsettling him more than the growl of any bear ever had. As he walked, his boots crunching on frost, he spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear. "You're trouble, little one, that's what you are. Trouble tied up in a bundle, but I'll be damned if I let the buzzards take you." His words were gruff, yet there was a gentleness underneath. The wilderness had taught him to endure storms, hunger, and solitude, but this was a trial of a different sort, and despite himself he found his pace quickening, as if every step was a race against time. By midday the trail narrowed between high cliffs, shadows stretching across the path. He paused to rest the mule, setting the baby carefully on his lap. The silence of the canyon pressed in, broken only by her soft breathing. Jedediah leaned his head back against the stone and let out a long sigh. "I reckon I've lived half a life already," he said quietly. "Never thought I'd be starting a new one." He didn't know what tomorrow held. He only knew he could not walk away from the burden fate had placed in his arms. The mountains had shaped him into a man of endurance, but now endurance alone would not be enough. As the sun sank behind the ridges, Jedediah tightened his grip on the reins and kept moving. The wilderness had given him many trials, but none like this. The trail bent downward, and Jedediah Cole found himself circling back toward the cliff where he had first heard the cries. He hadn't meant to return, but something in him demanded it, a need to see the place again to be sure he had not dreamed it. The baby stirred in his coat, a small sound rising from her throat like the mewl of a kitten. He tightened his arms around her and kept walking, boots crunching on stone. When he reached the rim, the memory rushed over him as sharp as the wind that swept the ledge. He looked down, scanning the rocky shelf where he had found her. Nothing remained. No scrap of quilt, no sign of footsteps, no trace that a life had clung to the stone. Only the endless drop stretched below, and the cries that had once filled it were now a memory pressed into his ears. Jedediah squatted, brushing his calloused hand over the earth. It was bare, cold, indifferent. Yet his mind replayed the sound he had heard, that whisper carried by the wind. "Don't go. he muttered to himself. "Ain't no wind I ever heard sound like that." His voice came rough, as though he feared someone might answer. The baby stirred again. He glanced down, meeting her gaze. Her eyes, bright, round, impossibly alive, fixed on him with a trust he had not earned. It unsettled him more than the whisper had. He cleared his throat and spoke in the low tone of a man unused to words. "You don't know what kind of man you got stuck with, do you? I live by my own company. Ain't no room for you in a life like mine." Yet even as he said it, he shifted her weight so her head rested more comfortably against his arm. Her tiny fingers brushed against his coat, clinging as if she understood him well enough. The sky darkened with clouds drifting in from the west, carrying the promise of snow. Jedediah rose to his feet, casting one last look into the canyon. "If there's somebody out there watching me," he said, his voice steady despite the unease creeping through him, "you ought to know I ain't walking away, not from her." Turning from the cliff, he began the climb back to his camp. Each step carried the weight of responsibility, a burden he had not chosen but could no longer deny. When he reached the fire pit, he stoked the coals back to life, feeding them with twigs and dry bark. He sat with the baby close to the warmth, studying her features under the flicker of flame. She was small, too small for this harsh land, her skin pale against the rough quilt. But her breath came steady, and her grip on his finger was surprisingly strong. The night pressed close, filled with the sounds of coyotes calling across the ridges. Jedediah shifted uneasily, not from fear of predators — he had faced grizzlies with nothing more than a knife — but from the weight of uncertainty. What was he to do with her? "Guess I'll call you Little Bird," he said quietly. The name slipped out without thought, born from the sound of her cry that had pierced the canyon like a bird calling for its flock. He tested it again. "Little Bird. Suits you, I reckon." The child's lips twitched, almost as if she smiled, though Jedediah knew it was no more than chance. Still, it stirred something warm in him, something he had thought buried beneath the years. Hours later, as the fire dimmed, Jedediah lay back against his bedroll. He kept the baby nestled close, wrapped against his chest so she could feel his heartbeat. His eyes traced the stars above, and he thought again of the whisper. He told himself it was wind, no more than that, but deep inside he knew it had sounded too much like a plea. "Don't go." The words lingered in his mind as he drifted toward uneasy sleep, the baby's small breaths reminding him that whether he liked it or not, he had already made his choice. Jedediah Cole rose before dawn, the chill of the mountains creeping into his bones. The baby whimpered softly inside the folds of his buffalo coat, her warmth pressed against him, as if she already knew he was the shield between her and the merciless world. He sat for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of the fire, torn between instincts. His life had always bent toward solitude, the mountains his only companion. But carrying this child into the high country would be a death sentence. He muttered almost to himself, "Ain't no way around it. Gotta take you down to folks who can keep you alive." The mule brayed softly as if disagreeing, its breath a cloud of steam in the cold morning air. Jedediah tightened the straps on his saddle and swung the bundle of gear into place. The baby stirred, releasing a thin cry that cut through him sharper than the wind. He hushed her awkwardly, rocking her against his chest. "Easy now, Little Bird," he said, using the name he had given her. "Ain't far. Just gotta keep moving." The trail wound steep and narrow, hugging cliffs that dropped into shadowed valleys. Patches of ice clung stubbornly to the rock, and the mule's hooves slipped more than once, forcing Jedediah to steady the animal with a sharp pull of the reins. His eyes scanned the ridges constantly. Wolves moved in packs this time of year, lean from winter's hunger, and though he had seen none, he felt their presence. The baby's cries came and went, sometimes silenced by the motion of the ride, other times rising suddenly, demanding his attention. Jedediah had faced storms that buried passes under feet of snow, fought off grizzlies with nothing but a rifle butt, endured weeks without speaking to another soul. But nothing unsettled him like her small, insistent wail. Bert cut through the armor of solitude he had built around himself. By midday, clouds gathered thick and heavy. Snowflakes began to fall, swirling in the gusts that swept through the canyon. Jedediah pulled the coat tighter around the baby, shielding her face from the storm. He pressed his cheek against the top of her head, whispering words he hadn't spoken in years. "You just hold on. We'll make Gunnison by night if we keep steady." The road down from the mountains was never kind. He crossed a frozen river, the mule's hooves cracking the brittle surface of ice. Jedediah walked beside the animal, boots numb from the cold water seeping in, but he kept moving, his body a wall against the wind. Every few minutes he glanced down at the child, half afraid she would no longer be breathing, but each time her small chest rose and fell, her grip clutching at the rough fabric of his coat, as if she knew her life depended on him. As dusk settled, he crested a rise. In the distance, faint smoke curled into the sky. The sight pulled a grunt of relief from his throat. "Town," he said under his breath. "Ain't much, but it'll do." Gunnison lay ahead, no more than a cluster of wooden buildings huddled against the endless expanse of land. For Jedediah, it had always been a place of trade and little else. But tonight it meant shelter, food, and perhaps an answer to the question that gnawed at him since the cliff: who had left this baby to die? The baby whimpered again, the sound softer now, almost weary. Jedediah rubbed her back with a rough but careful hand. "Nearly there, little bird. Nearly there." The trail narrowed one last time before opening toward the faint glow of lanterns. Jedediah's jaw tightened. He had no love for townsfolk and even less for their stares, but for the first time in years, his choices were not his alone. The child shifted in his arms, a fragile weight that bound him to a responsibility he could not shake. And though the sight of Gunnison filled him with unease, he pressed forward, knowing the mountains no longer held the answers. The lanterns of Gunnison flickered against the cold night air as Jedediah Cole rode in, the mule weary and his own body aching from the long descent. The baby stirred beneath his coat, her faint cries drowned by the clatter of hooves on frozen ground. Gunnison was no more than a crooked street, lined with false front buildings, a saloon glowing warm, an inn with smoke curling from its chimney, and the sheriff's office at the far end. The sound of laughter and piano drifted from the saloon, clashing with the sharp bite of the wind. Jedediah dismounted stiffly, pulling the baby close. A pair of townsfolk, a man and his wife stepping out of the mercantile, stopped dead at the sight of him. Their eyes darted from his rough clothes to the small bundle in his arms. "Evening," Jedediah said, voice low. The man tugged his wife's sleeve, muttering, "That's Jed Cole, the mountain hermit." The woman's gaze fixed on the baby. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Dear Lord, what's he doing with the child?" Jedediah ignored them and made his way toward the inn. Whispers followed him, each step drawing more eyes from doorways and windows. In a town where everyone knew everyone, his presence with an infant was a spark in dry grass. Inside the inn, warmth wrapped around him, carrying the smells of stew and wood smoke. Behind the counter stood Clara Hastings, a tall woman in her 30s with auburn hair tied back, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She froze when she saw the bundle. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed curiosity. "What have you got there?" Jedediah shifted uncomfortably. "Found her," he said. "Up in the high country." "Found?" Clara stepped forward, lifting the edge of the coat. The baby blinked, tiny mouth opening in a weak cry. Clara's face softened instantly. Merciful heavens! Before Jedediah could explain further, the door opened again. Sheriff Amos Briggs entered, tall and broad with a badge pinned to his vest. His boots thudded across the floor as he eyed Jedediah. "Cole," the sheriff said flatly, "word's already spreading. Folks say you walked in with a child. Care to tell me how that happened?" Jedediah squared his shoulders. "Wasn't no rumor. I heard her crying on a cliff edge. Climbed down, pulled her up. She'd have been dead if I'd left her." Briggs narrowed his eyes. "And you expect me to take that as gospel? Man like you, living in the hills all these years, shows up with a baby out of nowhere. Doesn't sit right." Clara stepped between them, her hands on her hips. "Sheriff, look at her. She's cold, hungry, and in need of care. Whatever you think of Mr. Cole, he brought her here instead of leaving her to die. That ought to count for something." The sheriff scratched his jaw, clearly torn. "Maybe. Or maybe he knows more than he's letting on." Jedediah's voice came sharp. You think I put her there myself? For what? I ain't got nothing to do with town business or anybody's child. The baby whimpered again, the sound silencing the room. Clara lifted her arms. Give her to me, Jedediah. I'll see to her for the night. Reluctance tugged at him. He had carried the infant across ridges and rivers, shielded her from snow and wind. Handing her over felt like losing something he hadn't even known he wanted. Still, he laid the child gently in Clara's arms. She's strong, Jedediah said quietly. Stronger than you'd think. Clara rocked the baby, her face softening into a tenderness that silenced the room's doubts. She'll need milk. I'll find someone to help. You've done right, Jedediah. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The sheriff's gaze lingered on Jedediah, suspicion still clouding his expression. We'll talk more in the morning. Don't go wandering off. Jedediah met his stare evenly. I ain't running, not from this. The murmurs outside thickened, the town alive with speculation. And though Jedediah had handed the baby to Clara, he knew in his bones that his part in her story was far from over. Morning light spilled over Gunnison, revealing a town already abuzz with whispers. The baby had become the subject of every doorstep conversation, every murmur exchanged between merchants and ranch hands. Men leaned against fence posts. Women at wash lines paused mid-task, all speculating about where she had come from and why Jedediah Cole had been the one to carry her in. Inside the inn, Clara Hastings rocked the infant by the fire, feeding her a mixture of milk carefully prepared by a neighbor woman. The baby's cries had softened, her tiny fingers curling around Clara's hand with surprising strength. Jedediah stood nearby, arms folded, his tall frame stiff, as though he were bracing against judgment. He felt every glance from the doorway, every whisper that floated in from the street. His world had always been the mountains where silence meant safety. Here the noise of suspicion pressed against him like a noose tightening. Clara looked up at him, her eyes sharp but kind. She took to the milk. Strong little thing, just as you said. Jedediah gave a grunt. Told you she wasn't about to give up. The door creaked open. Sheriff Amos Briggs stepped inside, removing his hat. His eyes lingered on the baby before turning to Jedediah. Town's restless. You brought in a storm, Cole. Jedediah's jaw tightened. Storm wasn't mine to bring, I just didn't leave her to die. The sheriff's voice carried the weight of authority, but underneath was unease. There's talk she belongs to the Caldwells. Some folks say they had kinfolk vanish not long ago. You know what that means. Jedediah frowned. Caldwells own half the valley. Don't mean they own her. Clara shifted the baby in her arms. You think the Caldwells abandoned a child on a cliff? That's madness. Briggs shook his head. I don't know what to think. But people don't cross the Caldwells lightly. If the child is tied to them, this town could find itself caught in the middle of something ugly. Jedediah's voice came low, edged with steel. And what about the child? Who's speaking for her? Silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of firewood. Clara rocked the baby gently, her expression softening. I will, she said firmly. She'll stay here with me until the truth comes clear. The sheriff studied Clara for a long moment, then sighed. Do as you think best, but don't be surprised if the Caldwells come asking questions. When he left, Jedediah turned toward Clara. You don't know what you're inviting on yourself. Clara's eyes met his without flinching. And what about you, Jedediah? You could have kept riding, left her where she lay, but you didn't. That tells me something about the man folks say is nothing but a hermit. Her words pricked deeper than he expected. He shifted uncomfortably. I didn't ask for this. No, Clara said softly, but maybe you were meant to find her. The baby stirred, cooing faintly. Jedediah felt his chest tighten. He had always been an outsider in Gunnison, a man mistrusted for his solitude. Now suspicion thickened around him like smoke, yet in Clara's words there was no accusation, only recognition. Outside, footsteps passed, voices carrying. That Cole fella's mixed up in something. Sheriff'll sort it out. Caldwells won't let this stand. Jedediah clenched his fists. The wilderness had always been his refuge, but this was no storm he could outlast by hiding in the high country. Trouble was circling, And it wasn't just wolves this time. He looked once more at the baby, her tiny chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. For reasons he could not explain, he knew walking away was no longer an option. The following day dawned with a pale sky, the kind of morning that promised thaw but still carried a sting of winter in its breath. Gunnison stirred early, and with it rumors thickened like smoke rising from every chimney. Jedediah Cole walked the street, boots heavy against the wooden boards, aware of eyes tracking his every move. The baby remained with Clara at the inn, safe for the moment, but that didn't ease the tension building around him. Sheriff Amos Briggs caught up with him outside the livery. His hat shadowed his face, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed the weight of bad news. "Cole," the sheriff said quietly, "we got a problem." Jedediah leaned against a post, folding his arms. "Reckon you better spit it out." Briggs glanced around before lowering his voice. "Word is one of the Caldwell ranch hands went missing the same night you claim you found that baby. Folks are talking. Some say he was seen heading into the hills carrying something. Now they think that child might be his." Jedediah's brow furrowed. "And what if she is? Don't change how I found her. Alone, damn near ready to fall to her death." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Problem is the Caldwells don't take kindly to scandal. If that baby's theirs by blood or kin, they'll want it hushed one way or another. And if it ain't, they'll still be quick to pin blame on the nearest man who can't defend himself. Which'd be me," Jedediah muttered. Briggs didn't argue. "You're an outsider, Cole. Always have been. Easy target for suspicion." A silence stretched between them, until the sheriff finally added, "Watch your step, this ain't just gossip anymore." Jedediah walked away, jaw set, thoughts heavy. The Caldwells were a name he knew well enough. Cattle barons who controlled land and water rights, men who bent the law as easily as they bent wire fences. Their money bought silence, their riders enforced it. If the baby carried their blood, the truth might be buried under fear and intimidation. Back at the inn, Clara rocked the infant in her arms, her expression soft but troubled. She looked up as Jedediah entered. "You've heard then?" she asked. Jedediah gave a single nod. "Sheriff told me. Folks think she's tied to the Caldwells." Clara's eyes flashed. "And what if she is? That doesn't give anyone the right to cast her away like a sack of grain." Jedediah sank into a chair, his hands rough and scarred against the polished wood. "You're right. But it means trouble's coming. Caldwells won't want this child seen, not if it stains their name. And folks here, half of 'em owe the Caldwells their livelihood. They won't stand against 'em." Clara studied him, her voice steady. "And what about you, Jedediah? Will you stand?" Her words cut deeper than he expected. He thought of the baby's tiny fingers gripping his coat, the trust in her eyes. He thought, too, of the whisper he had heard at the cliff, the plea that still haunted him. He rubbed his beard, silence heavy between them before he finally spoke. "I ain't walked away yet." Clara's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. "Then don't start now. She needs you even if you don't see it. Even if... A child abandoned once can't be abandoned again." The baby stirred, releasing a faint cry. Jedediah rose, stepping closer. Clara placed the child in his arms, and as he looked down at her, something inside him hardened into resolve. Outside, the sound of hooves pounded against the dirt street. Jedediah turned toward the window. Riders approached, dust rising around them, hats low, coats marked with the Caldwell brand. Clara's eyes met his, fear flickering beneath her calm. "It begins." Jedediah tightened his hold on the child, his gaze steady. He had lived his life alone, with no ties to anyone. But now, for the first time in years, he knew he had something worth standing for, and trouble had found its way to his door. Jedediah Cole left the inn at first light, the baby safe in Clara's arms, though his mind stayed with her every step. The town felt different that morning. The air held a charge, like the stillness before a storm. Men gathered in small knots outside the saloon, whispering, their eyes flicking toward him and then away again. Gunnison was no place for secrets. Every rumor galloped faster than a mustang across the plains. He saddled his mule, intending to ride for supplies. A man could face trouble on an empty stomach, but not without powder, lead, and food enough to keep strength in his bones. As he secured the straps, the sheriff's warning echoed in his head. Watch your step. By mid-morning, Jedediah had ridden several miles beyond the town. The trail wound through a stretch of pines, the air thick with the scent of sap and damp earth. Snowmelt trickled in streams that cut across the path, forcing him to slow. The quiet pressed heavy until it broke. From the tree line, 3 riders emerged. Broad hats shadowed their faces, coats dusted with trail dirt, rifles resting easy in their hands. Their horses snorted, restless, as if sensing the tension between men before steel was ever drawn. Jedediah reined in his mule, his gaze steady. "Morning," he said flatly. The lead rider, a lanky man with a scar running down his cheek, gave a humorless grin. "Coal, ain't it?" "Heard you been playing nursemaid." Jedediah's eyes narrowed. "Don't know what you mean." "Oh, you know." The man leaned forward in the saddle. "Word is you found something up in them hills, something that don't belong to you. Be smart now. Hand it over, and maybe you keep breathing easy." Jedediah's grip tightened on the reins. "She ain't something. She's a child." "And she ain't yours?" The man's grin faded, replaced by a cold glare. His companions shifted, their hands drifting toward rifle stocks. "Careful, mountain man. You don't know whose toes you're stepping on." Jedediah felt the weight of years in the wilderness settle into his bones, years of facing predators that moved on 4 legs instead of 2. His voice came low, calm as a river, but edged with warning. "I've lived alone in these mountains long enough to bury men who thought I was easy pickings. You reckon to try? You best not miss." For a moment, silence stretched. The riders eyed him, measuring the man against the legend whispered in town. Then the scarred leader spat to the side. "This ain't over, Cole. You can't fight the tide. Best learn to let go before it drowns you." With that he wheeled his horse, the others following. They disappeared into the trees as quickly as they had come, leaving the trail empty once more. Jedediah exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing only slightly. He knew threats when he heard them, and these weren't empty. The Caldwells, or men working in their shadow, were moving to keep the child's existence buried. He urged the mule forward, senses sharp. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of undergrowth put him on edge. The wilderness had always been his refuge, but now it felt like a chessboard, each move watched by unseen eyes. By the time he returned to Gunnison with his supplies, the sun had dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of fire. Clara met him at the door of the inn, worry etched into her face. "You were gone longer than I thought," she said. "Everything all right?" Jedediah shook his head. "Riders, 3 of them, told me to leave it be." Clara's expression hardened. "And what did you tell them?" He met her gaze, voice steady. "That she ain't theirs and I ain't letting her go." Clara studied him, something like pride flickering behind her worry. "Then you'd best be ready, Jedediah, because they'll be back." He glanced toward the crib Clara had set by the fire, where the baby slept in peaceful innocence. Trouble was circling, closer with each day, but looking at her, Jedediah knew there was no turning back. The baby's cries pierced the quiet of the inn, sharp and insistent. Clara Hastings held her close, rocking with a steady rhythm that came as naturally to her as drawing breath. She hummed low, a tune without words, and slowly the cries softened to whimpers, then to silence. The firelight cast warm shadows across Clara's face, softening the weariness in her eyes. Jedediah Cole watched from the far side of the room, arms crossed, shoulders hunched, as if he carried the weight of the mountains themselves. He had faced threats the night before, men who thought intimidation enough to send him running. But it wasn't the memory of their rifles that gnawed at him now. It was the sight of Clara, her tenderness, her strength, and the way she looked at the child with something he couldn't name. Clara broke the silence. "She trusts you, Jedediah. I can tell. Even when you hand her to me, she looks around, waiting to hear your voice." Jedediah shifted uncomfortably. "Don't know much about trust." "Not from a child, anyhow." "You underestimate yourself." Clara glanced down at the baby, her voice softening. "She knows who saved her. That matters." The words unsettled him. He scratched at his beard, trying to push away the stirring inside his chest. "Ain't sure I saved her. Might have just carried her into more trouble." Clara's gaze sharpened. "You carried her away from death." "That's saving enough." Her conviction held a strength that made Jedediah fall silent. For a woman who had seen her share of loss, Clara spoke like someone who had chosen hope over despair. He knew her story, at least the whispers. A child lost years before, fever taking life before it had even begun. It explained the way she held the baby, not only with care but with something deeper, a fierceness that came from pain, transformed into resolve. Later that evening, townsfolk crowded into the inn, drawn by curiosity as much as by stew and ale. Conversations swelled, eyes flicking toward Clara and the infant resting in her arms. One ranch hand leaned too close, his voice carrying over the murmur. "Best give that baby back where she belongs. Ain't no good comin' of keeping her here." Clara's eyes flashed. "Belongs? She belongs where she's safe, not left to die on a cliff," the man sneered. "You don't understand the way things are run around here, Miss Hastings. Some folks don't want her around." "You'd be wise to remember that." Before Jedediah could step forward, Clara's voice rang out firm and clear. "Then they can come tell me themselves, and I'll give them the same answer. She stays." The room fell quiet. Jedediah watched, a flicker of admiration breaking through his stern exterior. Clara's words carried more weight than a drawn gun. She wasn't a fighter in the way he was, but she stood with a courage that couldn't be shaken by whispers or threats. When the crowd thinned and night settled heavy, Jedediah approached her. "You spoke bold," he said. Clara looked at him, her eyes steady. "And would you have me speak small? She needs a voice, Jedediah. Someone has to say she matters." "If we don't, who will?" He nodded slowly, her words sinking deeper than he cared to admit. He had lived his life avoiding entanglements, letting the world pass him by. But Clara reminded him of something he thought long gone, the fire to stand for more than survival. The baby stirred in Clara's arms, her tiny hand reaching outward until Jedediah stepped closer. Her fingers caught his coat, clutching tight. Clara smiled faintly. "See? Even she knows." Jedediah's throat tightened. He rested a calloused hand gently against the child's back. "Then I reckon she's got two voices now, yours and mine." Clara held his gaze, no words spoken, yet understanding passed between them. Whatever storm brewed outside, whatever shadows the Caldwells cast over Gunnison, they both knew one truth: the child would not face it alone. The mountains called Jedediah back. Though Gunnison offered shelter, his instincts told him answers still lingered where the baby had been left. The whisper haunted him, echoing in his sleep, and every time he looked at the child, he felt the pull to return. One grey morning he saddled his mule and set out, leaving Clara with the baby. Snow still clung to shaded hollows, though spring thaw had swollen the streams. The trail felt quieter than before, heavy with a silence that pressed against him. When at last he reached the cliff where he'd first found the child, he dismounted slowly, scanning the ledges and rocks as though expecting the ghost of that moment to rise again. The wind cut sharp, carrying the scent of pine and stone. Jedediah crouched low, his hand brushing along the dirt, searching for anything out of place. At first, he found nothing but scattered pine needles and loose rock. But then his eyes caught a flash of color half buried near the ledge, a scrap of fabric caught under a stone. He pulled it free, fingers stiffening when he realized it wasn't cloth at all, but folded paper, stained dark at the edges. The mountain air had weathered it, but words still remained, written in a hand that trembled with desperation. Jedediah unfolded it carefully and read aloud in a low voice. "If anyone finds her, know she was born of betrayal. I could not keep her safe. Forgive me. Don't let him take her." The words struck him like a blow. He read them again, slower this time, tasting their weight. Born of betrayal. Don't let him take her. His jaw tightened. Whoever left this note had known danger was closing in. And the him spoken of could only be someone with power enough to inspire such fear. He folded the letter and tucked it into his coat, eyes narrowing as he stared into the canyon below. The memory of the whisper returned, sharper now, less a figment of his mind, and more the echo of someone's final plea. On the ride back, his thoughts churned. If the baby was truly the result of betrayal, it explained why men wanted her gone. She wasn't merely an inconvenience, she was evidence. Proof of something those in power would rather erase. By the time he reached Gunnison, dusk had fallen. The inn glowed with lamplight, the sound of Clara's voice drifting through the window, soft as she sang to the child. Jedediah stepped inside, boots heavy on the floorboards. Clara looked up, her expression tightening at the sight of his face. "You found something," she said. Jedediah pulled the letter from his coat and handed it to her. "Read." Clara unfolded the paper, eyes scanning the words. Her lips pressed together, and when she looked up, sorrow and anger both burned in her gaze. This was written by a woman. You can see it in the hand, hurried, frightened, but careful enough to hope someone would find it. Jedediah nodded, and she meant for someone to protect the child, said not to let him take her. "Who?" Clara whispered. "Don't know yet," Jedediah replied, "but I reckon we'll find out soon enough. Men who leave notes like this don't last long." Someone silenced her. Clara held the baby closer, her voice trembling but steady. "Then we can't let the same fate fall on this child. If she carries proof of someone's sins, she's in more danger than we knew." Jedediah's eyes hardened. "Danger I can handle. But this means we're fighting more than shadows. We're fighting the kind of men who think they can bury truth with the bodies they leave behind." Clara folded the note again, her fingers trembling. "Then we'll keep it safe. And we'll keep her safe." The baby stirred, tiny fists clenching as though she, too, resisted the unseen threat pressing closer. Jedediah laid a rough hand gently on her back, his voice low. "They'll have to come through me first." For the first time, Clara did not argue. She only nodded, her resolve as fierce as his. The letter weighed heavy in Jedediah Cole's coat pocket, its words echoing with every step he took beyond Gunnison. He knew the Caldwells would not rest easy while that baby breathed, nor while the truth lingered on fragile paper. He had faced wolves and storms before, but men with power and fear on their side were often more dangerous. That truth arrived sooner than he expected. He was crossing a highland pass at dusk, the air thin and sharp, when the crack of a branch snapped through the silence. Jedediah froze, hand drifting toward the rifle slung across his back. The mule brayed nervously, ears twitching. Then the riders came. 3 again, but this time with no attempt at pleasantries. Guns glinted in the fading light. The scar-faced man from before called out, his voice rough with confidence. "Told you once, Cole. Should have listened. Now you're riding too close to business that ain't yours." Jedediah shifted his weight, planting his boots firm on the stony ground. "The business of leaving a child to die don't belong to any man, least of all to the Caldwells." The riders stiffened, the name spoken aloud like a spark to dry grass. The scarred man snarled, "You best shut that mouth." Jedediah's rifle slid into his hands, not raised yet but ready. His voice stayed calm, steady as a river stone. "You ride at me with guns, you'd better be ready to finish what you start. I ain't looking to spill blood, but I'll do what I must." The standoff stretched, the wind whistling through the pines, horses pawing at the ground. The men's fingers twitched near their triggers, but none moved first. They knew Jedediah's reputation. Mountain men lived by instincts sharper than any blade, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had walked away from fights others hadn't. Finally, one rider shifted, trying to circle behind. Jedediah barked, "Don't!" The word cracked like a whip, and the man froze. The scarred leader spat into the dirt. "This ain't finished. You think you can stand alone against ranchers with half the valley in their pocket? You're a fool." Jedediah's jaw tightened. "Maybe I am, but I ain't a coward who leaves babes on cliffs." Anger flashed in the man's eyes, but he yanked his reins, turning his horse sharply. "We'll see how long you hold that ground, Cole." They rode off into the twilight, hooves pounding against rock until only silence remained. Jedediah lowered his rifle slowly, breath leaving him in a long exhale. The tension in his shoulders ached, but his resolve held firm. He had not fired a shot, yet the message was clear. Violence hovered near, waiting for the next chance to strike. He continued on, senses alert, the mule steady beneath the darkening sky. Each mile carried him deeper into the truth. He was not merely protecting a child, he was standing against men who would sooner erase lives than admit their sins. By the time he returned to Gunnison, night had settled. The inn glowed like a beacon. Clara met him at the door, her face tight with worry. "You're late," she said, her eyes scanning him as though searching for wounds. "Riders," Jedediah answered simply. "Same ones. They came looking to scare me off." Clara's lips pressed thin. "And did they?" He shook his head. "Not likely." She studied him, then nodded slowly. "Good. Because fear is what they count on. If you don't yield to it, they lose their hold." The baby stirred in the cradle by the fire, her small hands reaching upward as if sensing his return. Jedediah stepped closer, resting a hand on the edge of the crib. His voice came low, meant only for her. "They tried again, little bird, but we're still standing." Behind him, Clara's voice carried quiet strength. "And we'll keep standing. Whatever comes." For the first time in years, Jedediah felt something beyond survival settle in his chest, a purpose clear as the mountain air. Trouble had come with rifles and threats, but it had not broken him. Not yet. The hidden letter lay on the table of Clara's inn, its creased paper catching the lamplight. Clara read it once more, lips moving silently over the desperate words. Jedediah sat across from her, his hands clasped, the silence between them heavier than any snowstorm he'd ever weathered. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice low but unwavering. "This child, she isn't just abandoned. She's been hidden, covered up." Jedediah nodded grimly. "Reckoned as much, but who'd she need hiding from? The way that note's written, the woman feared a man." "Someone with power." Clara's eyes flicked up, meeting his. "Victor Caldwell." Jedediah stiffened. "You certain?" "As certain as any woman who's seen his kind," Clara said. "He's heir to the Caldwell ranch, carries himself like a king while the rest of us bow our heads. He's never been one to bear the weight of consequence. If this child is his, born out of wedlock, then she's proof of his shame. Proof his family would do anything to erase." Jedediah leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. His thoughts churned, images of the riders, the threats, the letter, each piece fit together too cleanly. "So, that's it. This ain't just about scandal. It's about burying truth." Clara clutched the baby tighter, her jaw set. "And they'd have buried her along with it if not for you." The infant stirred, eyes blinking open. Clara rocked her gently, her voice softening though fire still edged her words. "She deserves a name, not just little bird. A true name. Something to remind the world she was never meant to be forgotten." Jedediah hesitated, then spoke quietly. "What did you have in mind?" Clara looked down at the child, studying her features with a tenderness that masked her grief. "Grace, because that's what she is. Undeserved, unexpected grace in the middle of all this darkness." Jedediah let the name settle in the air. Grace. It felt right, like a promise spoken aloud. He nodded slowly. "Grace it is, then." The baby cooed, her small hand brushing Clara's chin as if in agreement. Jedediah's chest tightened. He had never been a man for sentiment, yet the weight of the moment pressed deeper than he could deny. Grace. A name meant to carry her through storms. Clara turned to him, her expression hardening again. "But a name won't shield her from the Caldwells." "They'll come harder now, Jedediah. The closer we are to the truth, the more dangerous this becomes." Jedediah's eyes narrowed, his voice steady. "Then let 'em come. I ain't backing down. Not while she's breathing." Clara studied him, searching his face as though testing the steel of his resolve. What she found seemed to ease her shoulders, though her worry never vanished. "You've lived alone a long time, but this fight isn't yours alone anymore. You understand that, don't you?" He looked at her, then at the child in her arms. "Reckon I do. Ain't easy, but I see it clear enough. Wolves don't circle unless there's something worth protecting." The fire crackled, filling the silence. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying the distant howl of coyotes. Jedediah thought of the mountains, the freedom of solitude, and realized he could never return to that life unchanged. Grace had tied him to something greater than himself. Clara brushed a strand of hair from her face, her tone softer now. "You may have saved her once on that cliff, Jedediah, but what lies ahead, it's more than one man can shoulder. She'll need more than strength, she'll need a future." Jedediah leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Then we give her one, no matter what it costs." Clara's eyes glistened in the lamplight, but she nodded, holding Grace closer. Between them, an unspoken vow took shape, binding them to the child and to each other in ways neither had expected. The secret was no longer hidden. And with its revelation came a choice neither could walk away from. Sheriff Amos Briggs sat behind his desk, the weight of law and land etched into the deep lines on his face. The office smelled of tobacco and dust, a single lantern burning low. Jedediah Cole stood across from him, the folded letter resting on the desk between them like a live coal. Clara had stayed back at the inn with Grace, but her words echoed in Jedediah's mind. She'll need more than strength. She'll need a future. Briggs tapped the letter with one thick finger. "You understand what this means, don't you?" Jedediah's voice came low. "I understand it proves the Caldwells tried to bury their shame on a cliffside. I understand a woman died right in it, or worse. And I understand that baby's breathing is the only thing standing between truth and silence." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You talk bold for a man who's lived most of his life running from folks. But this ain't a trapline squabble, Cole. The Caldwells don't lose. Not in court, not in business, not in blood." Jedediah leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Then maybe it's time they did." The room fell still, the only sound the creak of the chair as Briggs leaned back. For years the sheriff had walked the thin line between law and survival, knowing that to push too hard against the ranching family was to risk the whole town's stability. Yet here lay the truth written in desperate ink. Briggs sighed, rubbing his temples. "I took an oath to uphold the law, but law in these parts and it bends with the wind. Folks depend on the Caldwells. Their cattle feed the valley, their coin keeps stores open. You ask me to stand against that. You ask me to put Gunnison itself at risk." Jedediah's eyes hardened. "And what of Grace? You reckon her life's worth less than cattle and coin? You reckon a child's cry means nothing if it inconveniences men with too much land?" The sheriff looked at him, the silence stretching long. Finally he spoke, voice quieter, tinged with conflict. "I've seen men break under less. You carrying this fight alone'll see you buried." Jedediah straightened, shoulders squared. "Ain't alone, Clara stands with me. And that child, she's reason enough." Briggs studied him, the lines of hesitation still etched deep. Then he rose slowly, crossing to the window. The town lay quiet under starlight, but shadows moved, men loyal to the Caldwells, keeping watch. He knew the storm was already here. Turning back, he spoke with the gravity of a man making peace with his own choice. "All right, Cole, I'll back you. Not because I think it'll be easy, not because I believe we'll win, but because you're right. If law don't stand for the innocent, it don't stand at all." Jedediah gave a single nod. "That's all I needed to hear." Briggs walked back to his desk, pulling open a drawer. He set a tin star on the wood, sliding it toward Jedediah. "Don't mean you're sworn, but if you're fighting this, you'll do it with me, not outside me. Understand?" Jedediah eyed the badge but didn't touch it. "I ain't no lawman, never will be, but I'll fight beside one." The sheriff allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Fair enough." They both looked at the letter once more. Its words seemed to glow under the lantern, fragile yet powerful. The voice of a woman who had risked everything to protect her child. Briggs exhaled heavily. "Keep her close, Cole. If the Caldwells want her gone, they'll come sooner rather than later. And when they do, we'll need every ounce of steel we've got." Jedediah's voice came firm, steady as stone. "Let 'em come." The sheriff nodded, his decision sealed. For the first time in years, Gunnison's law had chosen conscience over fear, but both men knew the price was yet to be paid. The air turned brittle as word spread that the Caldwells were riding into town. Gunnison braced itself in silence. Windows shuttered, doors barred, lanterns dimmed. Folks knew better than to linger in the street when power rode heavy on horseback. Jedediah Cole stood at the edge of town, rifle across his back, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. Clara waited inside the inn with Grace, though her last words before he stepped out clung to him. "Don't let them take her, not ever." Sheriff Amos Briggs joined him, shotgun resting easy in his grip. The man's face was grim yet resolute. "They'll want to make a show of this, intimidate the town, prove no one crosses them." Jedediah's jaw tightened. "Then we don't bend." The rumble of hooves broke the stillness. Out of the dust rose Victor Caldwell himself, younger than Jedediah expected, but with arrogance etched deep into every line of his posture. He rode flanked by 6 armed riders, each hard-eyed and silent, their presence a wall of threat. Victor reined in at the center of town, his horse snorting steam into the cold air. His gaze swept the street before landing on Jedediah. "You've got something that belongs to me," Jedediah's voice cut sharp. "Ain't yours, Caldwell. Never was." Victor's smile was thin, cruel. "That child is mine by blood. You think you can stand between me and what's mine? You're nothing but a relic of the hills." Sheriff Briggs stepped forward, badge catching the faint light. "Law says a child ain't property, Caldwell. She's a person, and we've got proof enough she was meant to be silenced, not saved." The riders shifted in their saddles, hands twitching near revolvers. Victor's eyes narrowed. "You'd side with him? Against me?" Briggs didn't flinch. "I side with what's right. That baby lives, and she stays here. You'll not lay a hand on her." The standoff thickened. Silence stretched tight as a drawn bow. Jedediah felt his heartbeat steady, his grip on the rifle firm. He had faced grizzlies in the dead of winter, storms that swallowed men whole, but nothing like this. This was a storm of will, of courage against corruption. Victor leaned forward in the saddle, his sneer curling. "You really think you can hold against me? I own this town, Sheriff. I own its people. One word from me and you'll be buried without a marker." Jedediah stepped closer, his voice deep, unwavering. "I've lived alone long enough to know a man's only as strong as the truth he carries, and your truth's rotten. You abandoned her, Caldwell. Left her to die. That ain't strength, it's cowardice." For a moment the mask slipped from Victor's face, fury flashing raw and unguarded. His hand twitched toward his gun, but before he could draw, Clara's voice rang out from the inn's doorway. "She's not yours." Every head turned. Clara stood tall, the baby cradled against her chest, her eyes blazing brighter than the lantern behind her. "She's not a secret to be hidden or a burden to be cast aside. She's a child. And she will not grow under the shadow of your shame." The declaration struck like thunder. Townsfolk who had hidden now peered from behind shutters, drawn by the sound of defiance. Victor's face twisted, but the sight of the sheriff, Jedediah, and Clara united, the baby in plain view, weakened his stance. His riders shifted, uncertain. Fearless when silencing whispers, but less steady when the truth blazed in daylight. Victor spat into the dirt, rage simmering but leashed. "This ain't finished," he hissed. He yanked his reins, turning his horse sharply. One by one the riders followed, dust rising as they retreated into the dark. The silence they left behind was heavier than their arrival. Briggs exhaled, lowering his shotgun. "They'll lick their wounds, but they'll be back." Jedediah looked toward Clara, her arms wrapped tight around Grace. His voice carried steady, certain. "Then we'll be ready." For the first time, the people of Gunnison glimpsed a crack in the Caldwell's iron grip, and though the storm had not passed, the line had been drawn, clear, unyielding, and final. Dawn crept over Gunnison, painting the mountains in soft gold. The town lay quiet after the storm of the night before, but the silence felt different now. Less fearful, more expectant, as though folks had seen a crack in the shadow that had long stretched over them. Jedediah Cole walked down the main street, his boots heavy but steady, the rifle still slung across his back. He had not slept much. The image of Victor Caldwell retreating into the dark replayed in his mind, a reminder that the fight was not finished. But for the first time, he felt he was not walking alone. At the inn, Clara sat near the hearth, Grace nestled in her arms. The child slept peacefully, her tiny breath steady against the quiet. Clara looked up as Jedediah entered, a tired smile crossing her face. "You stood like a mountain," she said softly. Jedediah shook his head. "Wouldn't have stood at all if you hadn't spoken. Took more courage to step into that doorway than to raise a rifle." Clara's gaze softened. "Then perhaps between us, we've got enough." The sheriff arrived not long after, his expression weary but resolute. "Caldwells won't forget last night," Briggs said, lowering himself into a chair. "But neither will this town. They saw men and women stand against fear. That kind of thing don't vanish easy." Jedediah leaned against the wall, arms folded. "You reckon they'll come again?" Briggs nodded. "In time, but they'll find the ground less steady. Their grip ain't what it was." He looked at Grace, his voice quieter. "Sometimes one small life can shake the mightiest tree." Clara brushed a hand across the child's cheek. "She's more than proof of shame. She's proof of hope." Jedediah studied the baby, her face relaxed in sleep, her hand curled into a tiny fist. He thought of the day he'd first heard her cries echoing off the canyon walls, the whisper that had urged him not to go, the burden he had carried down from the cliff. He had been a man bound to solitude, surviving without ties, believing that was all his life could be. Now standing here, he knew better. Grace had changed him. Clara's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "What will you do now, Jedediah?" He looked at her, then at the child. The question carried weight, but the answer came simple. "Stay. If she's to grow, she needs more than a wanderer's life. She needs a home, and maybe it's time I stopped running from one." Clara's eyes glistened, though she held his gaze steady. "Then you won't be alone in it." "Not anymore." The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. In that quiet, Jedediah felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of belonging, not to the wilderness, but to people, to Grace, to Clara, to a future that demanded courage not only against storms and wolves, but against despair itself. Outside, townsfolk began to stir, opening doors, stepping into the morning light. They nodded to Jedediah as he passed, not with suspicion this time, but with something closer to respect. The mountain man had become more than rumor. He had become proof that even in a place ruled by fear, one choice to stand could change everything. Jedediah paused on the porch, gazing toward the mountains. He would always carry their silence in his bones, but now it was no longer an escape. It was a memory, a chapter of a life that had found new purpose. He whispered almost to himself, "Don't go." The words no longer haunted him. They steadied him, a reminder of the plea that had begun it all and of the promise he had kept. Grace stirred in Clara's arms, her small eyes blinking open to the morning sun. Jedediah stepped closer, brushing a finger across her hand. Her grip closed tight around him, stronger than her size should allow. "Reckon you ain't letting go," he said softly. "And neither am I." For those who followed this tale of survival, redemption, and the fight for justice on the frontier, don't forget to subscribe now. There are more stories waiting in the dust of the Old West, stories that carry the weight of courage and the fire of hope. And if you want to keep riding with us, click the video waiting for you on the screen. Another story begins there, just as this one finds its end.